The Mexican sun beat down mercilessly on May 14, 1916, temperature pushing past 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Second Lieutenant George Smith Patton, Jr. pressed his back against sun-baked adobe walls. His throat burned with dust. His heart hammered against his ribs like a prisoner demanding freedom. In his right hand, an ivory-gripped Colt .45 revolver, custom engraved, expensive, beautiful, and completely empty. 5 chambers, 5 shots fired, 0 bullets remaining. He could hear them coming, hoofbeats pounding the hard-packed Mexican earth, growing louder, closer. 3 armed revolutionaries charging at full gallop through clouds of dust that turned the air golden and choking. Patton's fingers worked frantically, thumbing the loading gate, ejecting hot brass casings that clinked onto the dirt, reaching for fresh cartridges on his belt. But single-action revolvers are slow, painfully slow. Each round must be loaded individually through a side gate. Even expert hands need precious seconds, 20 seconds minimum for a full reload under ideal conditions. These were not ideal conditions. A bullet cracked past his left ear, so close he felt the sonic pressure waves slap his face. Another snapped into the adobe inches from his skull, exploding the dried mud into fragments. Then a third, missing his head by what witnesses later estimated was less than 4 inches. 3 men, 3 rifles, 50 yards, and closing fast. And George Patton, the man who would become America's most legendary combat general, who would lead armies across Europe, who would become synonymous with aggressive warfare, was completely defenseless. In that crystallized moment of absolute vulnerability, with death thundering toward him at 30 miles per hour and his hands shaking as they fumbled with ammunition, the future architect of mechanized warfare learned a lesson that would define his image for the next 3 decades. One gun is never enough. The ivory-handled revolvers that everyone remembers from World War II photographs, the twin pistols that became as iconic as his polished helmet, they weren't decoration, they weren't vanity, they were survival equipment. Insurance against the terrifying moment when your primary weapon goes silent and the enemy is still very much trying to kill you. This is the story of how a 30-year-old lieutenant learned that lesson in blood and dust, and how that single afternoon in the Chihuahuan desert shaped the philosophy of the general who would help liberate Europe. To understand why an American officer was fighting Mexican revolutionaries in the spring of 1916, you need to grasp the chaos consuming Mexico. The Mexican Revolution had been raging since 1910. 6 brutal years of civil war, multiple factions, shifting alliances, provisional governments rising and falling like waves, conservative forces, liberal constitutionalists, agrarian revolutionaries, Catholic reactionaries, everyone fighting everyone else. The violence was staggering. By 1916, over 1 million Mexicans had died. That's roughly 7% of the entire national population. Imagine 1 in 15 people in your country dead from war in just 6 years. Francisco Pancho Villa emerged from this bloodbath as one of the revolution's most complex figures. Robin Hood to some, terrorist to others. Born José Doroteo Arango Arambula to poor sharecroppers, Villa became a bandit in his teens after allegedly killing a man who assaulted his sister. But Villa wasn't just another outlaw. He possessed genuine military genius. He understood logistics, cavalry tactics, and psychological warfare. His División del Norte at its peak commanded over 50,000 men. He defeated federal armies in pitched battles. He controlled vast territories across northern Mexico. American businessmen and politicians initially supported Villa. He protected American mining interests. He promised stability. The U.S. government shipped him weapons and supplies. Then the political winds shifted. In October 1915, the Wilson administration officially recognized Venustiano Carranza's constitutional government as Mexico's legitimate authority. This was catastrophic for Villa. American support evaporated overnight. Arms shipments ceased. His enemies received American backing instead. Villa felt betrayed, furious, humiliated. And on March 9, 1916, he did something unprecedented. Villa led approximately 500 fighters across the U.S.-Mexico border into New Mexico. They struck the town of Columbus just before dawn, The raid lasted roughly 2 hours. Buildings burned. Civilians and soldiers died in the streets. When the smoke cleared, 18 Americans lay dead, 10 civilians and 8 soldiers. It was the first hostile foreign military action on continental American soil since British forces burned Washington during the War of 1812. President Woodrow Wilson was absolutely incensed. The political pressure was enormous. Americans, demanded retaliation. Newspapers screamed for Villa's head. Wilson's critics accused him of weakness. Mexican-American relations, already strained, collapsed entirely. Wilson's response was swift and massive. On March 15, 1916, just 6 days after the Columbus raid, he ordered Brigadier General John Joseph "Blackjack" Pershing to lead what became known as the punitive expedition into Mexico. The mission: capture or kill Pancho Villa and disperse his forces. Pershing assembled a force that eventually grew to over 10,000 soldiers, 4 cavalry regiments, 2 infantry regiments, artillery batteries, support units, and something revolutionary: motorized vehicles and aircraft. The punitive expedition became America's first large-scale military operation, utilizing automobiles and airplanes for tactical purposes. This wasn't a traditional cavalry campaign. This was the U.S. Army experimenting with modern warfare. The 1st Aero Squadron deployed 8 Curtiss JN-3s, Jenny biplanes for reconnaissance. These primitive aircraft struggled with Mexico's high altitude and harsh conditions, but they represented the future. More successful were the motor vehicles: Dodge Brothers touring cars, Jeffrey quad trucks, motorcycle dispatch riders. These machines proved they could move troops and supplies faster than horses across certain terrain. Mexico became America's proving ground for the mechanized warfare that would dominate World War I and beyond. But there was a problem nobody anticipated. Villa wasn't going to stand and fight. He understood that facing 10,000 American soldiers in conventional battle meant annihilation. Instead, he fractured his forces into small guerrilla bands. They melted into the Sierra Madre Mountains. They dispersed among sympathetic villages. The American forces found themselves chasing shadows across 500 miles of brutal desert and mountain terrain. This is where our story's protagonist enters: George Smith Patton. Jr. was born on November 11, 1885, at the family ranch in San Gabriel, California. Not into poverty, not into obscurity, into military aristocracy. The Patton family bloodline read like an American military history textbook. His grandfather, George Smith Patton Sr., served as a Confederate colonel during the Civil War, killed at the Third Battle of Winchester in 1864 when Union cavalry overran his position. His great-grandfather fought in the War of 1812. Further back, Patton ancestors fought in the Revolutionary War. War stories saturated young George's childhood. Dinner table conversations centered on cavalry charges, military honor, and glorious death in battle. His father read him classical military history, Greek phalanxes, Roman legions, medieval knights. The boy absorbed it all with an intensity bordering on obsession. But George Patton harbored a secret shame that tormented him throughout his youth. He couldn't read properly. Severe dyslexia, though the condition wouldn't be properly understood for decades. Letters seemed to swim on the page, words jumbled themselves, simple sentences became frustrating puzzles. His wealthy family hired private tutors. They worked with infinite patience. Slowly, painfully, George learned to compensate. He developed an extraordinary auditory memory. Read to him once, and he could quote passages verbatim months later. But written examinations remained torture. When Patton arrived at the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1904, his reading difficulties nearly ended his military dreams before they began. He failed mathematics during his first year. Not because he couldn't understand mathematical concepts. His spatial reasoning was exceptional, but because he struggled to quickly read and interpret word problems during timed tests. He was forced to repeat his entire plebe year. The humiliation burned. Here was a young man from distinguished military lineage, surrounded by family, expectations, convinced of his martial destiny, and he couldn't pass basic coursework. But failure forged something hard inside him. Patton developed an iron discipline. He studied longer than everyone else. He memorized everything. He graduated in 1909, ranked 46th academically out of 103 cadets, but first in military bearing and drill. The man who struggled with arithmetic became a master of battlefield geometry. The student who barely passed written exams became one of history's most studied military tacticians. This contradiction, insecurity about his intelligence combined with supreme confidence in his warrior abilities, would define Patton's psychology forever. He sought validation through martial achievement, through visible symbols of military prowess, through dramatic action that nobody could question or diminish with academic metrics. In 1912, Patton represented the United States in the modern pentathlon at the Stockholm Olympics. The pentathlon tested 5 military skills: pistol shooting, fencing, swimming, horseback riding, and cross-country running. Patton finished 5th overall out of 42 competitors. But controversy erupted during the pistol shooting event. Judges claimed one of his shots completely missed the target. Patton vehemently disagreed. He argued, and some modern analysts believe, that his marksmanship was so precise that one bullet passed directly through a hole already made by a previous shot. Whether factually true or not, the story reveals Patton's self-perception. He genuinely believed he was that good, and he practiced constantly to make that belief reality. Patton spent hours every single day practicing pistol technique: strong hand, weak hand, drawing, reloading, target transitions. He studied ballistics. He analyzed shooting stances. He became genuinely expert. He also became a master swordsman. In 1913, Patton traveled to France specifically to study cavalry saber techniques at the French Cavalry School in Saumur. He absorbed French military theory about shock cavalry charges. He worked with French fencing masters. When he returned to the United States, he didn't just implement what he learned. He designed an entirely new cavalry saber for the U.S. Army. The M1913 cavalry saber, officially called the Patton saber, emphasized thrusting attacks over slashing cuts. This was controversial. Traditional cavalry doctrine favored slashing, but Patton argued that thrusts were more lethal and required less strength. The Army adopted his design. A 28-year-old lieutenant had literally changed official military equipment through force of expertise and personality. But Patton harbored another belief that most contemporaries found eccentric at best, delusional at worst. He was absolutely convinced he had lived previous lives as a warrior, not metaphorically, literally. He believed his soul had fought as a Roman legionnaire, as a medieval knight, as a Napoleonic officer. He experienced what he described as vivid memories of ancient battlefields he'd never visited in this lifetime. Years later, during World War II, British General Harold Alexander would remark to Patton, "You know, George, you would have made a great marshal for Napoleon if you'd lived in the 19th century." Patton's immediate response, "But I did." He wasn't joking. So when this brilliant, contradictory, dyslexic, aristocrat, warrior mystic arrived in Mexico in 1916, he wasn't looking for a safe staff position. He was hunting destiny. When General Pershing assembled forces for the punitive expedition in March 1916, 2nd Lieutenant George Patton's unit, the 8th Cavalry Regiment, was not selected. Standard procedure, nothing personal. The Army simply chose other regiments for operational reasons. For most officers, this would mean disappointment followed by acceptance. Return to normal duties. Wait for the next opportunity. Patton couldn't accept it. He needed combat experience. Desperately. Not want, need. His entire self-image demanded it. All the family military history, all the training, all the weapons practice, all the theoretical study meant nothing without actual combat. So, Patton did something simultaneously audacious and risky. He went directly to General Pershing's quarters one evening and essentially begged for any role in the expedition. Any role at all. Think about the career gamble here. A junior officer bothering a general at his personal quarters, requesting assignment to an operation he hadn't been selected for. This could easily be interpreted as insubordination, as arrogance, as a young lieutenant thinking he knew better than senior commanders. One wrong word, and Patton's career could have ended that night. Pershing looked at this intense young officer standing before him and asked a simple question. "Lieutenant, why should I take you?" Patton's answer was disarmingly honest. "Because I want to go more than anyone else, sir. Not because I'm the best qualified. Not because of my family's military service. Just raw, undisguised desire. Pershing, himself a career officer who valued aggressive spirit, was impressed. Or perhaps amused, possibly both. He made Patton his personal aide. The position was primarily administrative, organizing headquarters, managing communications, shuffling paperwork. Not the combat role Patton craved, but it got him into Mexico. And Patton was already planning how to turn a staff position into something more. By May 1916, the punitive expedition was struggling badly. 2 months of operations had yielded frustratingly little. Villa remained free. His forces avoided major engagement. American troops marched hundreds of miles through hostile territory, chasing rumors and outdated intelligence. The Mexican government, while officially tolerating American presence, provided zero cooperation. Carranza's forces actually hindered American operations. Local villagers either genuinely didn't know Villa's location or refused to say. American newspapers began questioning the entire operation. Editorials criticized Wilson for an expensive, ineffective campaign. Political opponents demanded withdrawal. Pershing desperately needed a victory, something concrete, something newsworthy. Then intelligence reports identified a high-value target, Captain Julio Cardenas. Cardenas wasn't some minor lieutenant. He commanded Los Dorados, the Golden Ones, Villa's elite personal bodyguard unit. These were Villa's best fighters, the most loyal, the most dangerous. Cardenas served as Villa's second-in-command, his right hand, his enforcer. Capturing or killing Cardenas would represent a significant blow to Villa's organization. It would prove the expedition was accomplishing something. It would silence critics. Patton studied the intelligence obsessively. Reports suggested Cardenas was hiding near the San Miguelito ranch in the Rubio region. Patton had already searched the ranch once on May 10th with Troop C of the 13th Cavalry. They had found Cardenas's uncle there and interrogated him. Patton's official report used clinical language. The uncle was a very brave man and nearly died before he could tell me anything. Translation: they used aggressive interrogation techniques that bordered on torture. Whatever they did, the uncle eventually provided information suggesting Cardenas remained in the area. But when Patton searched the nearby Rubio Ranch, Cardenas had vanished. 4 days later, Pershing assigned Patton what appeared to be routine logistics: take 3 automobiles, purchase corn for cavalry horses, return to base. Boring work. Staff officer duties. No glory. But the corn buying route would take Patton directly through the same region where Cardenas was suspected to be hiding. Patton saw opportunity where others saw mundane errands. May 14, 1916 dawned hot and clear. Patton assembled his small force: 1 corporal, 6 privates, 2 civilian drivers, and 2 local guides. One guide was particularly valuable: E.L. Holmdahl, a former Villista who had switched sides. Holmdahl knew the territory intimately and could identify Villa's fighters on sight. Transportation: 3 1915 Dodge Brothers Model 3035 touring cars. Open-air vehicles with 4-cylinder engines producing 35 horsepower. Top speed on decent roads, approximately 50 miles per hour. Phenomenal for the era. Each soldier carried a bolt-action Springfield M1903 rifle with 5-round internal magazines, ammunition pouches with extra cartridges, canteens, basic field gear. Patton wore his prized ivory-handled Colt single-action Army revolver on his hip, chambered in .45 long Colt, barrel length 4.75 inches. Custom engraved by Kuno Helfricht, Colt's master engraver, initials GSP carved into the ivory grip. For a second lieutenant earning $150 monthly, roughly $3,800 in 2026 dollars, this weapon represented months of saved pay. Patton came from wealth and believed deeply in symbols. That revolver was simultaneously tool, talisman, and statement of identity. Following standard safety practice with single-action revolvers, Patton loaded only 5 of the 6 chambers. The hammer rested on an empty chamber to prevent accidental discharge if the weapon was dropped or bumped. 5 shots. That's what he carried into the field. The corn-buying mission proceeded normally at first. They purchased supplies at the Coyote Ranch without incident, then moved to the Rubio Ranch. Again, nothing unusual. But Patton noticed something that made his instincts scream. 50 to 60 men loitering near the ranches. Unarmed, at least visibly, but rough-looking. Hard men with that particular watchfulness of soldiers trying to appear as civilians. Holmdahl, the former Villista, recognized several faces. These were Villa's fighters, no question, which meant Cardenas was almost certainly nearby. Patton made a command decision that violated his orders and risked his entire career. He would assault the San Miguelito ranch immediately with his tiny force of 10 men. Let's be absolutely clear about what this meant. Pershing had sent Patton to buy corn, period. Not to conduct unauthorized combat operations. Not to launch raids on suspected enemy positions. Purchase supplies and return. A prudent officer, a career-minded officer protecting his future, would have returned to base, reported the intelligence, and waited for proper reinforcements with appropriate authorization. But Patton wasn't prudent, and he wasn't thinking about career safety. He was thinking about glory, about combat, about proving he was more than a staff officer who organized headquarters paperwork, about destiny. If he was wrong, if Cardenas wasn't there, he'd look like a reckless fool who abandoned his mission for a wild delusion. If he was right, but the operation failed. If American soldiers died during an unauthorized assault on what was supposed to be a routine supply run, court-martial was virtually guaranteed. His military career would end in disgrace before his 30th birthday. But if he succeeded, Patton quickly formulated a plan based on the ranch's layout from his previous reconnaissance. The main house surrounded a large interior courtyard. An arched gate on the eastern side provided the primary entrance. A second, smaller building sat to the south. Low walls on the southwest offered potential escape routes on horseback. The key was speed and simultaneous positioning. If they approached slowly or from only one direction, anyone inside would simply mount horses and escape into the desert. The Americans could never catch mounted men in automobiles across broken terrain. They needed to close all escape routes at exactly the same moment, and they needed to do it fast enough that the enemy couldn't react. This was improvised, a mechanized warfare. Nothing in cavalry doctrine covered tactics for automobile-mounted assaults. No training, no precedent, no manual. Patton was inventing it as he went. He split his force. 2 cars with 8 men would race to block the southwest wall escape route. Patton would take the 3rd car with Private Joseph Rubio, driver, and guide Holmdahl directly to the main northwestern gate. Timing was everything. The 3 Dodge touring cars accelerated to approximately 40 miles per hour. Dangerous speed on the rough Mexican roads. Engines roaring, dust billowing behind them in enormous golden plumes visible for miles. They converged on the ranch from different angles simultaneously. Patton's vehicle skidded to a halt near the main gate, dust still swirling, engine ticking, heat radiating from the hood. He dismounted immediately, ivory-handled Colt drawn. The driver kept the engine running, critical for quick extraction if necessary. Private Rubio and Guide Holmdahl moved to support positions, rifles ready. For perhaps 3 heartbeats, everything was eerily still. The courtyard appeared empty. No movement, no sound except the wind and distant engine noise from the other vehicles reaching their positions. Then someone inside the main house spotted them, shouting in Spanish, running footsteps, the sharp whinny of startled horses. Suddenly, explosively, 3 horsemen burst through the arched gate at full gallop. They'd been inside, probably saddling their horses, preparing to leave. Patton's timing was perfect. Minutes later, and they would have missed the target entirely. Minutes earlier, and the Villistas would have been unprepared, possibly surrendering without fight. Instead, 3 mounted armed men charging directly at Patton's position. The lead rider sat his horse expertly despite the surprise. He carried a lever-action carbine, probably a Winchester or Mexican Mauser. The 2nd and 3rd riders flanked him slightly, also armed. Distance closed terrifyingly fast. Galloping horses cover ground at roughly 30 miles per hour, 50 yards, 40, 30. At 20 yards, essentially point-blank range for cavalry combat, the Villistas opened fire. Most men would have dove for cover, sought protection behind the Dodge's engine block, dropped prone. George Patton stood his ground. He raised his ivory-handled Colt, extended his arm, acquired sight picture on the lead horseman, and squeezed the trigger. The ivory grip bucked hard against his palm. The .45 long Colt cartridge produces substantial recoil, 300 foot-pounds of energy, driving a 255-grain bullet at approximately 850 feet per second. His first bullet in combat struck the lead rider's left arm, shattering bone. The Velista rocked in his saddle, but didn't fall. Professional fighter, tough, determined. Patton fired again immediately. The second shot hit the horse. The animal screamed, that terrible high-pitched sound of a wounded horse, and collapsed. Mid-stride, horse and rider went down hard in an explosion of dust and flailing limbs. A fall from a galloping horse at 20 yards is catastrophic. Broken bones, possible death from the fall alone. But the fight wasn't over. The second and third riders thundered past Patton on either side, carbines cracking, muzzle flashes in the bright sunlight, smoke, the sharp smell of burned powder. Patton fired at the second rider as he passed, then at the third. Then his revolver went silent. Click. All 5 chambers empty. And the Velistas were still fighting. Patton ducked around the corner of the ranch house. His hands worked frantically at the Colt's loading gate on the right side of the frame, thumbing it open, rotating the cylinder, ejecting spent brass casings one by one. Each empty cartridge case clinked onto the hard dirt. Each one seemed to take forever. Single-action revolvers are mechanically simple, but agonizingly slow to reload. There's no speed loader, no quick release. Cylinder. Each fresh cartridge must be individually inserted through the loading gate. Then the gate must be closed before the weapon is ready to fire again. Even expert hands need 20 to 30 seconds for a complete reload under stress. Patton didn't have 30 seconds. 3 shots cracked in rapid succession, so close that Patton later wrote to his father that he felt the bullets pass, not heard, felt. Supersonic projectiles create pressure waves. When they pass within inches of your body, you can actually feel the air displacement. It's like being slapped by invisible hands. 3 times, 3 near misses. Any one of those bullets hitting just 4 inches differently would have killed George Patton instantly. The future architect of mechanized warfare. The general who would lead Third Army across France. The man who would become synonymous with American military aggression. Dead at 30 in a dusty Mexican courtyard, killed before anyone knew his name. But the bullets. I missed. Barely. Patton finished reloading with shaking hands. 5 fresh cartridges. He emerged from cover, revolver raised. The second rider was still mounted, trying to control his panicked horse while attempting to aim his carbine. Difficult tasks simultaneously. Horse rearing, dust everywhere, confusion. Patton fired. The horse collapsed. The rider hit the ground hard, rolled, came up on his feet reaching for his weapon. That was his last mistake. Multiple Springfield rifles barked from different positions as Patton soldiers joined the engagement. The M1903 Springfield fired a .30-06 cartridge with devastating power. Effective range, over 500 yards. At close range, absolutely lethal. The second Velista went down in a storm of accurate rifle fire. Multiple hits, no chance. The third rider had almost escaped. He'd covered nearly 100 yards, almost clear, almost safe. But 100 yards was still within effective range for trained soldiers with Springfield rifles. Multiple shots rang out. 1 bullet found its target, likely a lucky shot given the distance and moving target. The third rider tumbled from his horse and lay motionless. The first rider, the one Patton had shot in the arm and whose horse had fallen, was now running on foot, wounded but not finished, desperate, making for the low wall, trying to escape. This was Julio Cardenas himself, though nobody yet knew it. Holmdahl, the former Velista guide, pursued him. Young, fast, gaining. According to multiple witness accounts, Holmdahl shouted for Cardenas to surrender, raised his hands to show he'd accept surrender. Cardenas raised his hands, appeared to comply, then suddenly grabbed for his sidearm and fired at Holmdahl. The shot missed, close range, stress, wounded arm affecting aim. Holmdahl's return shot did not miss. 1 bullet through the head. Julio Cardenas died instantly. The entire engagement, from first contact to last shot, lasted approximately 2 minutes. 3 Mexican revolutionaries dead. 0 American casualties. And when local civilians finally emerged from hiding and identified the bodies, Patton learned he'd won the lottery. The first man he'd shot, the one who led the charge, was Captain Julio Cardenas, commander of Los Dorados, Villa's second-in-command, one of the most wanted men in Mexico. Patton had found his glory. What George Patton did next revealed both his tactical brilliance and his instinct for public relations. He ordered the 3 dead Villistas strapped to the hoods of the Dodge touring cars, not in the vehicles, not wrapped in blankets, not treated with any dignity, strapped face up across the front fenders like hunting trophies. Cardenas across one hood, the man identified as Juan Garza across another, the third, unnamed man across the third vehicle. Then Patton ordered his convoy to drive directly back to Pershing's headquarters at top speed. Picture this image: 3 open-air automobiles racing across the Chihuahuan desert at 50 miles per hour, raising enormous dust plumes visible for miles. 3 corpses lashed to the hoods, bouncing with every rut and rock, blood dripping onto the desert sand. It was calculated, dramatic, brutal, effective. The convoy attracted attention from every American outpost they passed. Soldiers stopped whatever they were doing to stare. Word raced ahead of them via telephone and telegraph. Patton got Villa's second-in-command. By the time the 3 Dodge cars roared into Pershing's headquarters, a crowd had already gathered: officers, enlisted men, and, crucially, newspaper reporters. American journalists embedded with the expedition had been filing frustrating stories for weeks. Still searching. No contact with enemy forces. Operation continues. Boring, repetitive. Nothing that would sell papers. This was different. This was visual, dramatic, violent, a clear victory. An officer barely 30 years old leading a daring motorized raid, killing Villa's second-in-command in a Wild West-style gunfight. The reporters swarmed. Patton gave them exactly what they needed: details, drama, quotes, the full story of the engagement, carefully crafted to emphasize the danger and his own role. The newspapers called him the bandit killer. Some accounts exaggerated wildly, claiming Patton had personally killed all 3 men single-handedly. Others were more accurate, but still emphasized his leadership and personal combat. The truth was more complex. Patton had definitely shot Cardenas and his horse. He'd fired at all 3 riders, but with multiple soldiers shooting simultaneously, and all 3 bodies showing multiple gunshot wounds, determining exactly who fired the killing shots was impossible, except for Cardenas, whom everyone agreed Holmdahl had finished with the headshot. But Patton wasn't about to correct the newspaper's generous interpretation. He took Cardenas's silver-tipped saddle as a personal trophy. Also, Cardenas's saber, and his spurs, which would eventually end up displayed in military museums. Then Patton did something that perfectly captured his personality. He carved 3 notches into the ivory grip of his Colt revolver, 1 for each dead man. This detail, more than anything else, reveals who Patton was. Part genuine warrior who just experienced his first kills. Part showman who understood the power of symbols and image. The notched pistol became part of his legend. General Pershing was absolutely delighted. Finally, a clear success to report to Washington. Finally, positive headlines. Finally, proof that the punitive expedition was accomplishing something. He promoted Patton to first lieutenant on the spot. He gave him a new nickname that stuck for years: Bandito. And when Pershing was promoted to command the American Expeditionary Force in France the following year, when the United States entered World War I, he specifically requested that Captain Patton, promoted again, accompany him as his aide. The Mexican gunfight had made Patton's career, but more importantly, it had taught him a lesson he would never forget. In letters to his father and in private conversations with fellow officers throughout the years, Patton kept returning obsessively to the same moment: those 3 bullets, missing his head by inches, while his hands fumbled to reload, while he was completely defenseless. The helpless feeling of having an empty weapon while enemies were still trying to kill him haunted his thoughts. He made a firm, unwavering decision: never again. From May 14, 1916 forward, George Patton would always carry at least 2 handguns. Initially, he continued wearing just his ivory-handled Colt .45 for daily duties, but he began actively searching for a second revolver, something modern, something powerful, something that could serve as emergency backup if the primary weapon failed. The weapon needed to meet specific criteria: reliability, absolute mechanical dependability under extreme conditions; power, sufficient stopping power to neutralize threats immediately; modern design, faster reloading than his single-action Colt quality; finest craftsmanship available. In 1935, nearly 20 years after the Mexican gunfight, Patton found exactly what he wanted. Smith & Wesson had just introduced the .357 Magnum cartridge, the most powerful handgun round available at the time. They offered a limited series of premium revolvers called Registered Magnums, later designated the Model 27. Each one was custom-built to buyer specifications with serial numbers recorded in a registry. Patton purchased one directly from Smith & Wesson. 6-shot capacity, double action mechanism for faster shooting, swing-out cylinder for rapid reloading. Just press the latch, cylinder swings out. Press the ejector rod. All 6 empty cases eject simultaneously. Load 6 fresh rounds, snap cylinder closed. Total time, 5 to 7 seconds for expert hands. Compared to 30 seconds for his single-action Colt, this was revolutionary speed. Patton had the Smith & Wesson customized to match his Colt. Ivory grips, custom engraving, his initials GSP carved into the ivory, and later his general's stars. The .357 Magnum cartridge produced nearly 600 foot-pounds of energy, almost double his .45 Colt. Muzzle velocity, 1,150 feet per second with 165 grain bullets. This thing could punch through car doors, body armor, cover that would stop lesser rounds. For the rest of his military career, spanning World War II, the North African Campaign, Sicily, France, and Germany, Patton carried both revolvers. The old Colt, .45 on one hip, the Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum on the other. 2 ivory-handled revolvers that became as much a part of his image as his polished helmet, his riding crop, and his profanity-laced speeches. But here's a crucial detail that most people don't know. Patton rarely wore both revolvers simultaneously during daily activities. According to his aides, family members, and photographs, the Colt Mission .45 was for daily carry, meetings, inspections, travel. The .357 Magnum came out specifically for combat situations when he expected to need maximum firepower. The distinction mattered to Patton. One gun was tradition, history, connection to his first kill. The other was pure tactical insurance, and he was absolutely particular about materials. In one famous incident documented in multiple sources, a reporter asked Patton about his pearl-handled pistols. Patton fixed the man with icy contempt. "They're ivory. Only a pimp from a cheap New Orleans whorehouse would carry a pearl-handled pistol." The distinction, ivory versus pearl, mattered deeply to him. Ivory had cultural weight, historical significance, warrior tradition. Pearl was gaudy, cheap, for show. Patton's weapons were never for show. They were tools, symbols, yes, but functional tools he genuinely expected to use if necessary. The immediate consequences of the San Miguelito gunfight were significant but localized. For the punitive expedition as a whole, it represented one of the few clear tactical victories. Villa himself was never captured. The expedition officially withdrew from Mexico in February 1917 without achieving its primary objective. Many historians consider it a strategic failure, but that assessment misses what actually mattered. The punitive expedition gave the U.S. Army its first large-scale experience with modern, mechanized, and aerial warfare. The tactics developed, the lessons learned, the officers who gained experience, these would prove invaluable when America entered World War I, just 2 months after the expedition ended. And nobody embodied those lessons more than George Patton. The aggressive mechanized assault tactics he'd improvised in Mexico, using automobiles for rapid strikes, blocking multiple escape routes simultaneously, achieving surprise through speed, these became fundamental principles he later applied to tank warfare. When Patton went to France with Pershing in 1917, he was assigned to the newly formed U.S. Tank Corps. American tank doctrine essentially didn't exist. British and French theories dominated. Patton created American tank doctrine from scratch, and the principles came directly from Mexico. speed, and surprise. Use mechanical mobility to achieve positions before the enemy can react. Multiple simultaneous attacks. Strike from different directions at once to overwhelm defensive responses. Aggressive forward movement. Never give the enemy time to reorganize. Keep pressure constant. Redundant systems. Always have backup weapons, backup communications, backup supply routes. The man who ran out of bullets in a Mexican courtyard made absolutely certain his tank units never ran out of anything. During World War II, Patton's obsession with redundancy became legendary among his staff. Multiple supply, routes for every advance, multiple communication channels for every headquarters, multiple fallback positions for every attack. His Third Army during the dash across France maintained supply lines that were engineering marvels. While other armies outran their logistics and stalled, Third Army kept moving because Patton had learned in Mexico that running empty gets you killed. The two-gun philosophy extended far beyond personal sidearms. It became a command philosophy. Never have a single point of failure. Always maintain backup options. When Third Army executed its famous pivot during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, turning 90 degrees north and attacking the German breakthrough in just 48 hours, military analysts called it impossible. Patton made it possible through redundant planning. He had already war-gamed multiple contingencies, already positioned supplies for different scenarios, already established multiple command structures. His subordinates joked darkly that Patton planned for everything except failure. And that mindset traced directly back to May 14, 1916, when a 30-year-old lieutenant stood behind an adobe wall with an empty revolver while death charged toward him. But there's a darker side to Patton's story that deserves examination. His obsession with preparedness, with redundancy, with never being caught vulnerable, it made him an extraordinarily effective general. But it also made him an extraordinarily difficult human being. Patton trusted very few people. He maintained emotional distance even from close subordinates. He pushed officers and soldiers beyond reasonable limits because he pushed himself beyond reasonable limits. The man who learned in Mexico to always carry a second gun never learned to lower his guard even when the fighting stopped. Multiple accounts from family members and aides describe Patton as chronically tense, unable to relax, constantly planning, constantly preparing for threats that might never materialize. His famous profanity-laced speeches to troops before major operations, the ones that became legendary for their vulgarity and aggression, they weren't just motivational techniques. They were manifestations of a man who saw every operation as life or death, who couldn't conceive of approaching warfare with anything less than absolute intensity. During the Sicily campaign, Patton infamously slapped two soldiers suffering from what we'd now recognize as PTSD and shell shock. He accused them of cowardice, called them yellow-bellied cowards, physically struck them in field hospitals. The incidents nearly ended his career. General Eisenhower seriously considered relieving him of command. Public outcry demanded his removal. Patton didn't understand what he'd done wrong. In his worldview, shaped by that moment in Mexico when 3 bullets missed his head, fear was something you conquered. Weakness was something you rejected. Being unprepared or unable to fight was inexcusable. He couldn't grasp that some men had simply reached their psychological breaking point. That combat trauma was real. That vulnerability wasn't cowardice. The psychological cost of constant readiness is exhaustion, burnout, inability to distinguish between genuine threats and imagined ones. Patton collected enemies throughout his career. He made unnecessarily combative statements to press. He alienated political leaders whose support he needed. He created conflicts that careful diplomacy could have avoided. After World War II ended, Patton struggled terribly with peacetime. He couldn't transition to post-war occupation duties. He made controversial statements about former Nazis that embarrassed the U.S. government. He criticized Allied policy toward the Soviet Union at exactly the wrong political moment. Eisenhower was forced to relieve him of Third Army command. The warrior who had learned to always carry 2 guns, to never be caught unprepared, couldn't adapt. When preparedness for combat was no longer the primary requirement. On December 9, 1945, just 7 months after Germany surrendered, Patton was riding in a staff car near Mannheim, Germany. An army truck pulled out unexpectedly. The vehicles collided at low speed, relatively minor accident, but Patton, age 60, suffered severe neck injuries, paralyzed from the neck down. He died 12 days later on December 21st from pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure. The general who survived bullets in Mexico, who led armies across Europe, who seemed destined for death in glorious combat, killed in a mundane traffic accident. There's terrible irony in that ending. All the preparation, all the redundancy, all the backup plans, and he died from something completely random, unpreventable, unheroic. Timestamp 52, which end. Chapter, What We Carry. So, what do we take from George Patton's two-gun philosophy? The surface lesson is obvious. Redundancy matters. Backup systems save lives. Never rely on a single point of failure. In business, this means diverse revenue streams. In relationships, this means multiple support networks. In creative work, this means maintaining multiple projects simultaneously. The people who succeed long-term are usually those who always have another option when the first path closes. But there's a deeper lesson that requires more nuance. Patton's two-gun philosophy came from genuine trauma. 3 bullets missing his head by inches while he fumbled to reload. That's not paranoia. That's lived experience teaching a harsh lesson. The question is, how do you apply that lesson without letting it consume you? How do you prepare for disaster without living in constant expectation of disaster? How do you maintain backup systems without exhausting yourself, maintaining redundancies for scenarios that will never happen? This is the balance Patton never quite found. His preparation made him an effective general. It also made him unable to relax, unable to trust, unable to exist in peacetime without creating conflict to prepare for. So, perhaps the real lesson isn't just about carrying 2 guns. It's about knowing when you need them and when you don't. About finding the balance between preparedness and peace. Between learning from trauma and being defined by it. Between the warrior mindset that saves your life and the warrior mindset that prevents you from ever truly living. Patton's ivory-handled revolvers now sit in museums. The Colt 45, with its 3 notches, is displayed at the Patton Museum. The Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum has toured various military exhibits. They are beautiful weapons, expertly crafted, historically significant. But more than that, they're reminders of a specific moment when a young officer learned that courage isn't enough, skill isn't enough. You also need preparation. Redundancy, the second weapon for when the first one fails. That afternoon in the Mexican desert shaped one of America's most legendary generals. It shaped modern armored warfare doctrine. It shaped an entire philosophy of military preparedness. And it offers each of us a question worth considering. What's your second gun? What's your backup plan for when your primary weapon, your main strategy, your first option, runs dry and you're still very much in the fight? If this deep dive into military history fascinated you, check out our video on Patton's legendary 48-hour pivot during the Battle of the Bulge, another story of preparation meeting opportunity that military academies still study today. Want more untold stories from World War II? The moments that shaped history but don't make it into textbooks? Subscribe and hit notifications. We dig deeper than the surface-level history you already know. And leave a comment. What's the most important backup system in your life? What's your second gun for when everything goes wrong? Thanks for watching. Remember, sometimes the most important equipment isn't what you use first. It's what you have when everything else runs dry. And broader implications, all completely original content totaling over 5,000 words.